Hello, welcome to another episode of the Wholeness Wisdom Podcast. My name is Erin, and I am a trained guide in methods of neuro-linguistic programming and alternative methods for awakening to oneself. So in this episode, I am really happy to be offering to you an exploration into what our experience of desire, psychological suffering, and biological suffering are in order to discriminate what's really going on. I would like to talk about stress and suffering. And I also want to just put right up front that what I'm going to talk about today is how stress and suffering are not a natural function. They are a learned response. And how, when we know how to relearn that response, we can live without suffering. To begin this episode, I just want to talk about something that we can all relate to because we've all experienced this, and that is being a baby. We're all born into this life as babies. We have all known the experience of just being without learnings. So when I mean without learnings, I'm talking about the stages of development for a child. And one of the stages of development is individuation. And the recognizable sign that this is happening is when a baby can distinguish between mom and itself. And of course, we're talking about traditional experiences when a baby, has not been separated from its birth mother, talking about a baby and its mother, its first encounter with a caretaker. It doesn't matter who this caretaker is, the one who is feeding the baby, the one who is caretaking the baby primarily. The baby does not know me separate from caretaker. Furthermore, the baby doesn't distinguish me versus the world. And if you've ever noticed the way babies interact with the world, they have this kind of wide-eyed, almost tremoring vision. They're looking, and what are they seeing? Sometimes they'll even look at their hand or their foot. Everything they look at, it's this look of total immersion and wonder. And we've all been there. So during that process of development or individuation, where the baby learns me versus mom or caretaker, there is a process of communication that begins. At first, the way that a baby communicates is to simply cry. And to cry, it's a universal expression. We can all recognize crying as an expression of an unmet need. So even though this baby doesn't separate me versus the world, it expresses biological desires without having to think about it. So in other words, the baby doesn't suffer from having the need and thinking about not having it met. So the biological desires say the baby is hungry. It's immediate in its signaling. It takes no learned experience. And these are natural functions of the body. So as we get older, emotions often do have thoughts that accompany them, right? And as we learn to communicate our needs to others, not only do we begin to use language or body language to express our needs to others, when we start to use language, symbols begin to form in our inner experience that represent our needs and how to communicate that we need them met, asking for help. So when we are beginning to form these symbols in order to communicate, this inner narrative forms. And that's what I will be talking about when I refer to suffering today. That's what I mean. Our suffering is based on our relationship with an inner narrative. And it might be judgment, might be questioning, might be worry, Might be reliving the past, regret, memory, trauma, largely memories that are vivid and immersive. All of this is based on that inner symbolic narrative or dialogue. And these are all re-representations. So the re-representations, we can call this ability, the ability to re-represent an idea. So hungry, there's the immediate sensation of hunger. And to re-represent the hunger, there might be the thought, I want food. So this is an evolutionary development, right? In language, from crying to considering how to get the best, easiest resource. And this relied upon that ability to reproduce or represent the situation in our minds. So this is a biological evolutionary trait development because the body system wants to save calories. It wants to maximize the expense of energy in relation to the resources available to support that energy, getting more energy through food. And the purely evolutionary purpose of this is to get to the point where we can reproduce ourselves. So keep the race going, keep the human community alive. This is purely biological. It's an unconscious, the cells want to live. They want to reproduce. It doesn't take any metacognition to do that and to understand that. However, what is not a biological function, but is a learned function, is the degree to which our metacognition applies to our life these days. So present day humans. How does metacognition actually cause a problem in our life? So I would say that this inner narrative causes a problem in our lives because it's been overdeveloped. There's a misconception in our society that happiness and suffering are natural opposites, that suffering is natural, that it's inevitable. This is really coming from a belief that to emotionally suffer, so to suffer because I'm hungry and I don't have food, the metacognizing about the hunger, that's a belief that is innate, that is a function that comes with us, part and parcel of being a person. That belief is a failure to discriminate or just a confusion between what biological desires are, biological movements are, compared to suffering that comes from thoughts, the inner narrative. So this is over-exaggerated now in our current modern day life, much beyond its necessary function to say, I need food. How do I get food? Let's talk to the people around me. Let's, bargain, or let's get moving. Let's go get some food. It's over-exaggerated so much beyond that necessary function that now we have stress, anxiety about the future as it relates to my reputation, as it relates to my, financial stability, as it relates to my worth as a person on this planet. There's so much metacognition happening about the future and the past that while we've evolved to save energy and predict danger and acquire resources, there's now stress about so many aspects of life that really don't apply to anything that's happening in our moment-to-moment experience. And that inner narrative is a major source of pain in our lives, constantly producing stress. One main function of this, or I would say attribute of this inner narrative, is judgment and qualifying. So it's judgment, it's taking account, it's accounting for what's happening, and then applying a conception over it or an interpretation over it. So here's an example. My husband, say we have one sink full of dishes between us every day. And so the metacognizing narrative over here that's judging and accounting for could have this underlying sense of insecurity. So in order to be maintaining this front, this relationship, this way that we participate together in our home, there could be an accounting for how often he's doing the dishes versus how often I'm doing the dishes, and this subtle underlying accounting for or scorekeeping between us. Is that necessary? Is that a biological function? No. Is that an emotionally overdeveloped inner narrative that's stretching far beyond into a future fear based on a historical fear? What's not happening? Yes, that's what that is. These narratives are so constant. They're so happening so often that it's as though we're standing in front of a window looking out, but our face is so close to the glass, we don't even see the glass. We can't even register the glass because we're standing so close to it. That's how that narrative is. It's happening so constantly that we're too close to see it. And the truth is that that narrative being not a necessary function, but a learned function of the human, the good news is that it can be restructured, deconstructed, so that at first we can separate our experience from what's narrative and what's not narrative, what's happening at the same time that narrative is happening that is separate from the narrative. We can discriminate between what is truly happening and what is only the narrative. So we can see that what used to appear to be true, that we took for granted and normal, is just a habit. I'd like to distinguish that with wholeness work, self-investigation, and the direct path of awakening or knowing ourselves for what we truly are. This path is different than every new age or self-help program or spirituality that I've ever come across, because it's distinguishing between thinking or the narrative and what's beyond the narrative. An attribute of these self-help programs or spirituality or religion is that a lot of the time their approach is to change thinking so that it's more positive. And what we're doing here on the direct path is that we're not trying to change thinking at all. We are de-identifying from the thinking so that we're questioning. We're not just taking this as truth, but we're actually investigating. This thinking, is that me? And if we actually explore that, like use that question, is that thinking me? Is this thought me? No, right? The answer comes pretty quickly for most people. No, that thinking is not me. Okay, so what is me? It might seem like a really basic question, or even a question that doesn't really apply, like, so what? Why find out? Why even wonder what is me? The point is that when we disidentify as thinking, thinker, being the thinking or being the thinker, and actually explore, what do I mean when I say me? It begins an investigation of what we've been accustomed to taking as myself through this inner narrative, because the inner narrative has been layering on. It's like a paintbrush That's layering on another layer of paint every time we have an inner narrative thought that is applied to me. So when there's an inner narrative thought that's, I like this, that's another layer of paint. That's I. I likes this. And we say, I don't like that. It's another layer of paint. I don't like that. So this inner narrative is constructing this idea, this model of myself. And once that narrative is so deeply entrenched in our moment-to-moment experience, we actually have a false concept of what we are or who we are, just based on this inner narrative. And that's actually using a lot of energy. There's a lot of tension that is stored in the body when we're taking ourselves to be something that's limited or something that it's not really true, but it's just assumed to be true. The point of this podcast is to share with others practical ways to begin investigating who and what we really are. And I would say that when this investigation began for me, going the scientific route was really helpful because there was so much spirituality or religion that I had explored that really didn't give me anything to back it up. It really felt like dogma. Like people had said, because I said so, because this book told me so, take it from me. And I really don't like that approach, just take it from me. I really like to have all the information. So one way to begin finding out who and what we really are is to just begin with a simple discrimination or a simple investigation of what is a biological need, a biological suffering, versus a psychological suffering. And how do I know the difference? How do I recognize a biological need versus a psychological suffering? And this can be a question that you explore, maybe just today, maybe for 5 minutes. What is my psychological suffering based on? As I've explored this question, it keeps coming back to that inner narrative. Psychological suffering is based on that inner dialogue that is referring to the past or is referring to and reacting to the future imagined in my mind. Biological suffering, as far as I've explored it, is always in relation to a physical sensation in the body. It's a difference between perceiving a need and conceiving a problem. So this is for you to explore, and I hope that this has been an interesting investigation into the differences in suffering and whether or not suffering is necessary or normal, innate for the human being, or if it rather is a learned behavior that can be changed. And if it is a learned behavior that can be changed, what can we do to begin changing that? And to begin, I offer this simple investigation to discriminate, to find out for yourself, how do I know that I'm emotionally suffering? How do I know that the body has a need? And begin here. And I look forward to talking with you soon again on our next episode, which talks about the gift of desperation and how exasperation, desperation, being at the end of our rope, or really having had enough, is the spark that ignites the search for who we really are. So how do I know that I'm at that point of desperation? What do I do when I'm at that point of desperation? And what is the benefit of that kind of desperation? Is that psychological? Is that biological? And how we can really explore it, where to begin. I hope you've liked this episode today of the Wholeness Wisdom Podcast, and I will be talking with you again soon. Thanks so much for joining me.